So basically what we start talking about now is going to be on exam 4. And it's going to be a very haphazard assembly of key biological molecules, their properties and stuff. And for some reason that is unbeknownst to me, cellular respiration basics and gene expression basics, but whatever. So today we're going to start talking about lipids. So what are lipids? Lipids are nonpolar molecules that either contain so-called fatty acids or a steroid nucleus, 6 cyclohexane rings and 1 cyclopentane. Okay? They are hydrophobic but lipophilic, so they can be dissolved in organic solvents. The name comes from the Greek for fat, and they are super important in the structures of membranes, steroid hormones, energy storage, and certain fat-soluble vitamins. So conceptually, on the large scale, lipids can be based off of fatty acids. That's one big category. That category includes triglycerides, fats and oils, phospholipids, waxes, and steroids. You see, the structures are completely different. All good? Now, these types of lipids can be hydrolyzed using water and usually some kind of a catalyst, either inorganic or an enzyme. Steroids cannot be hydrolyzed. You can mix them with water all you want. Nothing's going to happen. Okay? Now, let's chat about further classification. We've already figured out steroids. So now let's take a look at fatty acid-based lipids. Okay? Now, hear me out. If you combine, seriously hear me out, a carboxylic acid, which is a fatty acid, see carboxyl group, and alcohol, remember how this group, works with this group, producing this group? They become an ester. So effectively, all these guys, in one shape or form, contain an ester functional group. They may contain 1, like in waxes, 3, like in triglycerides or triacylglycerols, 2, well, technically this is also an ester, but overall, bunch of groups, bunch of esters. So we're going to start with fatty acids. Two big groups of fatty acids are saturated and unsaturated fatty acids, and we're going to chat why this is important. So, first of all, look at the definition. What is a fatty acid? It is a carboxylic acid. So, this is a carboxylic acid. Do you agree with me? It's acetic acid. I think I am correct in terms of the number of carbons. So if you look at this acid, the one that I just drew, it has 16, 17, 18 carbons. But conceptually, it's the same idea. You see? So this is fatty acid. I think it is stearic acid, but I wouldn't take my words to the bank. I think stearic. Because the carbon chain is so long, these acids aren't soluble in water. And as we mentioned before, when all bonds between carbons are single bonds, it is a saturated fatty acid. When there is one or more double bonds, it is unsaturated. We good so far? Let me know if I need to slow down or, okay? Yeah, I was right. 18 carbon atoms. So, these are 4 different saturated fatty acids. Please notice they are not branched. Okay? 4 different fatty acids with different number of carbons. Do you see any correlation between the number of carbons and the melting point? When the number of carbons goes up from 12 to 18, what happens to the melting point? It goes up. The more carbons you have, the harder it is to separate individual molecules of saturated fatty acids so they can form a liquid. Does that make sense to you? Now, you may ask, well, why? Well, think about this. I can explain. So imagine you have a fatty acid, which is lauric acid, okay, with 12 carbons. Sorry. Okay? Good? This tail is pretty hydrophobic. There are only carbons and hydrogens. It is nonpolar. Am I making sense? Nonpolar structures can interact via dispersion forces. Okay? So in this case, 2 adjacent molecules will interact with each other by means of 11 carbons. All good? 11 carbons on one molecule will form dispersion forces with 11 carbons of another molecule. Certain number of bonds, okay? But if you have stearic acid with 18 carbons, it's going to be not 11 but 17, so dispersion forces will be simply stronger and it will be harder to separate the molecules and therefore the melting point will be higher. This is where you get it from. Stearic acid is present, for example, in butter. Okay, now you have unsaturated. Question? You have unsaturated acids. If they have only one double bond, they are monounsaturated, such as palmite, oleic, and oleic acid. Okay? Good? And remember, things like butter, well, almost any actual animal fat isn't just one type of fatty acids. And then we have polyunsaturated fatty acids. They contain more than one. So for instance, arachidonic acid contains 4 double bonds. Okay? Linolenic contains 3 and linoleic contains 2. Sounds good? So I'm sorry. This is oleic acid. How many carbons does it have? 18, right? Notice the melting point, and now compare that melting point to the one of stearic acid. Same number of carbons, but melting point differs by 55 degrees Celsius. All right? Good? If you go to polyunsaturated, that should be 3 here. The one with 2 double bonds melts not at 14 but minus 5 Celsius. And this one melts at minus 11. Okay? So you may see that if we have same number of carbons, when we start introducing double bonds, the melting point starts to drop. So these molecules are easier to separate from each other. And we're going to discuss why it happens, but to understand this, we need to remember about cis versus trans isomers. Okay? So I want you to take a look at these 2 examples of oleic acid. The monounsaturated fatty acids with 18 carbons. Remember, in cis orientation, hydrogens are on one side and carbons on another. In trans orientation, though, hydrogens are on the opposite sides as well as carbons. I want you to compare these 2 molecules based on how they look in very simple terms. What would you say the difference is between them in terms of the shape? The left one, yes, the left one is bent, or as biochemists say, it's kinked. And the right one is just a straight molecule, right? Well, before we get there, unsaturated fatty acids. Sorry, saturated fatty acids. My bad. Like this stearic fatty acid. Can they have cis or trans isomers? Saturated. They cannot. They don't have a double bond. So these molecules are linear. Does that make sense? So here's my question. If you have a bunch of linear molecules, I'm going to represent them with just lines. Look at this. Linear, 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 and linear. You can stack them up fairly easily. Does that make sense to you? If you have a bunch of kinked molecules, getting them stacked up is much harder. Okay? The comparison that we omitted in the beginning of that chapter was with potato chips. If you look at Pringles, they all have the same shape and stack up really well. But if you look at Lay's, they have different shapes and don't really stack up. So this is Pringles of fatty acids. And these are Lay's. And the more double bonds you have, the more kink you introduce into each molecule, which explains why these molecules interact better and therefore have higher melting points, while these molecules interact not as well and have lower melting points. Good? So as animals, we do produce a lot of saturated fatty acids. Humans, I mean. Technically speaking, if you take human fat and treat it with strong base, you can get soap. We'll talk about it in a minute. Okay? On the other hand, we do not get enough polyunsaturated fatty acids, and this is why we have to get them from the diet. This is why we call them essential fatty acids. So this is why, we should consume, if you're not a vegetarian, in addition to animal protein, fish is an important source. Oils, seeds, nuts are all important sources of fatty acids. So this is an illustration of the point that I was trying to make. That you see that saturated fatty acids, they can fit really well. So strong dispersion forces, these forces, and that means that they have higher melting points. So usually solids at the room temperature, and mostly, not exclusively, mostly from animals. Okay? Now, when fatty acids are unsaturated, you see how they can't really stack up, the chips example. So irregular shape does not provide such a strong interaction between the molecules, and that explains why they have lower melting points. Okay? Unsaturated fatty acids, again, usually from plants. Okay? Now, one example of fatty acid derivatives that are absolutely essential for our existence are prostaglandins. So prostaglandins are chemicals produced in the cells. The term is eicosanoids because they're produced from arachidonic acid. These are the examples of some of the prostaglandins. So when you see this PGF2, it means prostaglandin F2. What they serve as, mostly as the mediators of inflammation. Okay? And inflammation brings with it pain and fever. Okay? So these different chemicals, different prostaglandins, they regulate body temperature in response to infection, they regulate pain, they regulate fever, they regulate inflammation in response to injury. So when you have pain, what do you take? Ibuprofen or Tylenol, acetaminophen, or aspirin. Those drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they block the enzymes that produce prostaglandins. Okay? So these are, this is not a full list. Obviously, they did not put acetaminophen on the list, but those are indeed the blockers of this enzyme. No, I'm fine. Okay? Does that make sense? If I'm not sure about this one, I think ketoprofen is used very rarely now because it was shown to be side effects a bit too harsh compared to ibuprofen. So, this mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids, sometimes called omega-3 and omega-6. Okay? Why are they called omega-6, for example? Omega is the last letter of Greek alphabet. This letter can be used as a designation for the very last carbon in the chain. And then we start counting. So if this is omega, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this is our first double bond. See that? Omega 6. Arachidonic acid is also omega 6. Okay? Omega 3, omega 3 is the example of a fatty acid that has double bond at the third carbon counting from the end. See that? So omega-3 fatty acids are found in fish, fatty fish, cod, mostly cold water fish, herring. When I eat traditional Russian pickled herring, I justify it by telling myself that I'm consuming omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-6 you can get from plant oils. Now, another evidence that this book was written not by physiologists, because what is more beneficial to health? So, it has been shown that increased percentage of mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids in the diet generally reduces the risk for developing cardiovascular disease. Does that make sense? So there is an association between the intake of of unsaturated fatty acids and the levels of not just cholesterol, bad cholesterol, so-called very low density lipoproteins and low density lipoproteins. Okay? Now, before we move on, I want to say something that is, I think, important. I don't remember. I think we're not going to talk about trans fats, but I'm going to. So here's the deal. There are multiple studies that demonstrate, now hear me closely, that the consumption of saturated fats, such as pork, or the ones in pork or beef or dairy or whatever, has no association with blood cholesterol levels. I'm not talking about, like, if you decide to restrict your diet to 2 pounds of butter every day, that's a slightly different story, right? Yes, you're going to have hypercholesterolemia, but in the regular diet, if you drink milk or you don't drink milk, it does not affect your cholesterol levels. And I'm talking about bad cholesterol levels. In other words, all this blame for heart disease that saturated fats received is unjustified. Okay? What really increases the chances for developing cardiovascular disease, I will have to go all the way back here, is this. Okay? Trans fatty acids. Not the cis, but the trans fatty acids. So where do we get them from? Well, they are in oils and fats, that's for sure. But here's something I wanted to mention. Which type of fat is cheaper to produce, plant or animal? You need to get 1 pound of fat in the form of, fat or in the form of oil. What is cheaper to produce? Okay, you need, like, butter versus oil. What's cheaper? Oil. Plants are pretty cheap to grow, and you can use this, like, you have 10 cows in the field, or you collect, I don't know, several tons of corn or whatever, soy, okay? They're cheaper to produce, but there's a problem. They're not butter. They're not solid. Turns out you can turn them solid by hydrogenating and converting that double bond into single bond. Right? Remember, you saturate them, you make saturated acids. Hold on a second. Bear with me. Okay? Unfortunately, during that process, hydrogenation, some amount of trans fats is formed. And these guys significantly increase the concentration of bad cholesterol in the blood and the risk for cardiovascular disease. Where are you going to find those trans fats? Margarine or Crisco, whatever vegetable shortening. Does trans fat taste good? Oh my God, yes. It's rich, it's buttery, it's bad for you. So in Europe it's banned, in the United States it's not, but food manufacturers try not to add any trans fats into their products. However, I can tell you that fairly cheap frozen food, like frozen hamburger patties, usually contain trans fat. It makes them just taste better and stored better. Always read the label and don't buy trans fats. Okay, let's go back here, talk about waxes and triacylglycerides. So I'm going to skip the introductory part. What are waxes? Why do we like them? You have saturated fatty acid and a really long alcohol molecule. Okay? Good? Let me ask you this. How does the length of a carbon chain, how does it associate with the ability of a compound to be dissolved in water? The longer the chain, the less dissolvable, less hydrophilic, right? Now think about this. You combine a really long chain, say 18 carbons, in a fatty acid. And let's say 18 carbons in the alcohol. It's going to be pretty darn hydrophobic. So waxes, so you can imagine, are hydrophobic. They protect plants from the loss of water, right? They can, they are used by insects to make their exoskeleton, the chitin exoskeleton, more water repellent. And we use that wax to wax things out. You know, carnauba wax is used for cars. After you wax, imagine that you I don't know if you did that or not, but if you wash the car and then dry it and then wax it, and then there's raindrops just going to get away. Okay? You can see that waxes are used in a lot of cosmetic applications. Okay? Now, triacylglycerols. So, okay, technically speaking, hear me out. When we use the culinary term fat and oil, right? Let's say, okay, for simplicity, butter versus oil. When we say oil, liquid at the room temperature, and for the most part, it comes from plants. Butter, solid at the room temperature, comes from animals' milk. Why? Because, as we mentioned in oils, fatty acids are unsaturated, and in butter, they are saturated. However, we must remember that either oil or butter isn't just fatty acids. It is the esters of glycerol and fatty acid. So, How does that happen? This is glycerol. Okay? See, there are 3 hydrogens here. So glycerol is an alcohol which contains 3 hydroxyl groups. Then you have acid, carboxylic acid, 3 stearic acids. Okay? They form ester bonds. And just like we did before, we call it by using an alcohol part first, glycerol in this case, and the acid part second, tristearate. Sometimes it can be a combination, but it's not that common. So these triacylglycerols are used to store energy. So let's address this. Animals that hibernate. What is the first animal that comes to mind that hibernates over the winter? Yes. And bears, they pretty much bulk up before the hibernation season. There is a word, the term in Russian language, in Russian biological language, which is hilariously funny, but it essentially means to accumulate fat. So they eat a lot of high-carb foods, okay, high-calorie foods, and they don't spend that much energy during that time, so they accumulate enormous amount of fat in the body, okay? When they go into hibernation, their body temperature reduces, okay? They still have metabolism, but it's much slower, so they don't spend so much energy, and the fat that they accumulated allows them to go through the winter. Tangential, okay. So, yes. Tangential, but still relevant note. Do you know that there is a competition that is run by National Park Service for the fattest bear in Katmai National Park? You can Google it. Every fall there is an official, the viewer's choice, okay? People pick. It's like March Madness, but in the fall, there is a bracket of several grizzly bears in Katmai National Park. They all have names, and rangers constantly post the photographs of those bears, and people vote, and there is a winner every year. I think last year it was the bear named Colbert. Or maybe not. I don't, huh? Yeah. Yeah, they can maul you, of course, but other than that, yeah. Okay? Now, melting points, as we mentioned before, fats are solid at the room temperature because animals use saturated fatty acids when they produce triacylglycerols. Okay? Oil is usually liquid. Not all of them. Coconut oil is not liquid, but some differences. So this is like coconut oil. We can cross it out. Palm oil, it's pretty close to being solid. Okay? Now, listen. Palm oil and coconut oil are practically solid. Well, coconut oil is. This is not an easy question. I know that, but what illegal use of coconut and palm oil can you think of? I'm going to give you, like, you want to falsify something to save money. So butter, where does it come from? Milk. Now, milk is, animal products, as we figured, are pretty expensive. Okay? The plant products are much cheaper. Not coconut milk. When butter is made, I know it's a huge problem back in Russia, I know. Manufacturers cut butter, cut animal fats with plant sources such as palm oil and coconut oil. It's still kind of solid-ish when you buy it, but it melts at the lower temperature. It's not as good for cooking. It tastes okay. That makes sense, but it's not proper pure butter. I know for that, at least in Russia, there are like inspections all the time, and I read the news and it's like, oh, we got this brand and they cut it with palm or coconut oil, which is illegal. Okay? Different oils that are liquid are monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, okay? As we mentioned, palm and coconut, saturated. But here's something. So remember how we talked about the benefits of a diet with unsaturated oils, okay? Unsaturated fatty acids. We have that myth that was introduced, I don't know by whom, maybe Italians, that olive oil is kind of a king. In terms of health benefits, there is no detectable difference between all liquid plant oils. So sunflower oil isn't any worse than olive oil or corn or vegetable oil. They're not really worse than olive oil. People prefer the taste. That's a different story. Okay, but in terms of the health benefits, there's no difference. We discussed why melting points are different, right? Because this kink prevents the proper folding of the molecules of triacyl glycerols, and saturated fats have higher melting point, higher melting points. This is why they are solid at room temperature. Okay? Now this shows you the percentage, and I'm just going to focus on this. The blue columns show you how much saturated fatty acids you have. See? Solid, solid, solid. They're all solid because they have high percentage of saturated fatty acids. See that? Start looking at liquid. Most of them are unsaturated. Okay? We're going to go through triacyl glycerols, pretty much hydrogenation, stuff that we talked about, and I'm going to cut it and tell you the story that I wanted to tell. So, if you have double bond, you can treat it with hydrogen and saturate it. So you essentially can convert unsaturated fatty acids into saturated fatty acids by bubbling hydrogen through the hot oil. So you will go from liquid triacyl glycerol to a solid triacyl glycerol by modifying double bonds into single ones, which should increase the melting point of that substance, resulting in, I can't believe it's not a butter, or whatever, margarine, vegetable shortening. But, as we mentioned before, it results in the formation of trans fats. which are linear and solid. So this is wrong. They do not behave like saturated fatty acids. They behave differently. But increased proportion of fatty acids in the diet, it's been shown to increase bad cholesterol. Okay? Good? Changing, well, not really changing, so these are trans fats. This is the cis fat, and this is the trans fat. But something that I wanted to highlight, it's been shown, the myth that you shouldn't eat many eggs because they contain cholesterol. Bullshit. People who eat 2-3 eggs a day have, as a matter of fact, usually lower cholesterol because they do not consume trans fats that they would find in processed foods. Okay? So let's go through the list that we have for the foods that contain trans fats. Milk, eggs, and beef. Not really. Small percentage. Saturated, yes. Trans fats, not quite. Deep fried. Yes. Some of them do. Baked goods, like cookies are not baked, are they grilled? I don't understand. But if a baker uses vegetable shortening, Crisco, instead of butter, which is cheaper, then sure, trans fats. If it's butter, fine. Crackers and chips, not really, fully replaced. Stick and soft margarines, vegetable shortening, sure, that is true. Okay? Now, all right, how about that? We are roughly in the middle, perfect timing.